It happened faster than I expected. We'd been in Egypt 3 days. 3 days of roads winding toward Pharaoh's city. 3 days of Egyptian officials noting the size of Abram's flocks and the quality of his livestock and the woman walking beside him. I saw them notice Sarai. Their eyes would linger, then move to Abram, then back to Sarai. And I could see the calculation as clearly as I'd once tracked cereals formations in the river valley. Beautiful woman, wealthy household, brother, not husband, available. On the 3rd day the officials came. Not soldiers, but administrators. Men with authority and scrolls, the machinery of Egypt turning toward a woman who'd caught the wrong attention. They spoke to Abram as though he'd been asked rather than informed. The kind of courtesy powerful men offer when they've already decided to take what they want. "Pharaoh has heard of your household," the senior official said. "He would welcome your sister in his court." Welcome. The word landed on my chest like a fist. Abram's face didn't change. I watched him, watched for the crack. The moment of horror when he understood what his lie had set in motion. He'd worked the risk out on the road, back when it was still just worry. When the danger was a thing he could reason about from a safe distance. Now the worry was real, standing in front of him in Egyptian linen. And Sarai was about to pay for it. "My sister is honored," Abram said. His voice was steady. That was the part I couldn't get past. How steady it came out. How a man could hand his wife to a king in a voice that level and not shake with it. It pulled hard at me, that steadiness. I didn't know what to call the feeling. I only knew I couldn't stand in front of it and stay still. Sarai stood beside him and she'd heard. Her body didn't move, but something in her shifted. A tightening behind the eyes that I recognized from the courtyard in from the stone she'd worn smooth with years of asking. She looked at Abram once, but he didn't look back. They took her that evening. A procession of servants and officials escorting her toward Pharaoh's palace. And Sarai walked among them with her chin raised and her back straight and her face composed, giving them nothing they hadn't already taken. I followed her, not Abram, but her. Abram sat in his camp that night, surrounded by the gifts Pharaoh sent. Sheep and oxen, donkeys and camels, male and female servants. The bride price for a sister, payment for a lie. The wealth came in while Sarai was being prepared for Pharaoh's household, and Abram accepted it the way a man accepts a wound he knows he's earned, taking each gift with a nod and saying nothing. I didn't care about Abram's guilt then. I cared about Sarai. Walking through the corridors of the most powerful house on earth, alone, surrounded by people whose language she barely knew, waiting for a king who meant to make her his wife. And I cared about the promise that ran through her, through the children she hadn't born, the nation that didn't exist yet, the blessing for all the families of the earth that God had called out of a man in who had no reason yet to believe it. God's timing had never been hers. Now it might run out entirely if Pharaoh took what Abram had offered him. I reported to Michael. He was already above the palace, positioned at the highest point, looking down over the buildings and courtyards and gardens that made up Pharaoh's residence. His expression was the coldest I'd seen on him. It was not anger at Abram, but something flatter and harder than anger. The look of a commander who knows the time for prevention is gone and only the fight is left. "How many?" I asked. 30 of ours across the whole perimeter," Michael said. "More on the way. I've stripped the eastern border and the Sinai. Everything we can spare. And them? More than us. Siriel's had them in position for days. He didn't look away from the palace. He knew this was coming before Abram crossed the border. Of course he had. He'd told me as much on the road out of that he wouldn't stop Abram leaving, that he'd let him carry hope until it got heavy. The hope had gotten heavy, and the failure had come. And now Sarai was inside that palace, and the unseen space around it was filling with forces on both sides. She cannot be taken, Michael said. The same words he'd used at the border, in the same iron. The promise runs through her. Whatever happens in the world men can see, we hold the line in the one they can't. No fallen reaches her. 3 days, he said. God is moving. We hold until he's finished. I took the eastern wall of the palace compound. The wall itself was thick, stone and brick, raised by the labor of thousands. It meant nothing where I'd be fighting, where walls are made of presence and authority and not of material. But it gave me a place to stand, a line to hold, and the knowledge that on the other side of it Sarai was alive and whole, and I meant to keep her that way. The fallen hit us that first night, while the palace slept below. Not Siriel, not yet. His forward elements, a dozen of them, coming in from every angle and testing the perimeter as they'd tested Abram's camp in Canaan. More weight to it now, better coordination. He'd trained them well. They came in pairs, one high and one low, switching their angles so that driving off one left you open to the other. I took the first pair off the wall and was turning to cover the southeastern corner when a third came in from behind me. He'd been patient, waiting for the turn and coming in low while my back was to him. I felt him late. He hit me across the back and drove me into the wall. The pain was the particular cold of a fallen strike, the kind that doesn't just open you but reaches past the wound, looking for a hold on the spirit beneath. I twisted, brought my blade around, caught him along the arm before he could finish. He pulled off, and I held the corner. Terrell held the position beside me, though I didn't know him well. He'd been pulled off the Sinai border. A quiet warrior who fought with an economy I recognized from old soldiers. No motion spent that didn't need spending. He didn't push at the line the way the rest of us did. We pressed forward into the fight, but he just stood in it. I didn't know what to make of that the first night. The night settled into a pattern. Waves, short lulls, more waves. They weren't trying to break through, not yet. They were reading our positions, finding the weak seams in the line. Standard serial, probe, learn, then strike where it costs the most with everything at once. Where I was, there's no real day and night. Only the fighting and the gaps between, and the gaps kept getting shorter. Inside the palace, Sarai waited. I couldn't see her from the perimeter, but I could feel the promise. That thin trace I'd followed through the genealogies, the thread that ran from Seth down through Noah and Shem, through all the names between, to Tehu and to Abram, and now to this woman carrying the whole of God's plan in her body without knowing she carried anything at all. The thread held, and she was untouched. Whatever the palace was preparing, whatever Pharaoh intended, his timing was not God's timing, and we were holding the gap between the two. The second day, Siriel committed. His main force came against 3 sides of the palace at once, and the fighting stopped being skirmish and became the thing that doesn't let you breathe. I was holding the eastern wall and the southeastern corner both, managing it, and then the weight arrived. I felt it before I saw what caused it. A pressure settling onto the eastern wall, not from outside but from above and through, a slow settling weight. Not a blade, not a strike. A presence pressing its authority against the ground itself, the way a root grows into stone. This one was old. Not a thought, and not in words. It came in the body, older than the palace, older than Egypt. A presence that had been in this territory long before Pharaoh's grandfather's grandfather laid the first stone, and it intended the ground to remember that. The pressure said, "This is mine." I was here when they named this river. I have been here through every king and every altar, and every name they burned before gods who answered nothing. And you arrived with a wandering herdsman 3 days ago. What claim do you carry that can answer mine? I pushed back. My assignment, Michael's orders, the line I'd been holding since the first night. I pressed everything I had against the weight of it, and the weight didn't move. If anything, it deepened, pushing roots into the eastern wall, and I could feel the ground beginning to concede. Terrell moved before I understood what he was doing. He stepped into the pressure alongside me, adding his claim to the counterpush, and for a moment the weight eased. Then the old one turned toward him directly. What it brought against Terrell wasn't the ground or the wall. It pressed at him alone, and his light didn't bleed. It dimmed, not a wound but a silencing. Terrell's presence on that wall thinned, and the part that thinned didn't come back. He stayed on his feet, but there was less of him. "Fall back," I told him. "I can hold," Terrell said. His voice had been thinned, flatter and less of it. "Fall back," I said again. "That's not a request." He went, but he caught my arm first, and he said the only thing I ever heard him say: "Starve it." Then he was off the line. And I was alone with a pressure that had been in Egypt longer than the name of Abram's God had been heard in this ground. And it was settling back onto the wall and finding only me to push against. "Starve it." I pushed harder, and it was all I knew. More force, more claim, more of myself thrown against the weight of it. And the pressure deepened every time I pressed, as though each assertion of mine was the thing feeding it. Each claim I made was a claim it could answer and exceed, and every time I pressed I felt how much older its hold was. The unmaking weapon came at the same moment I ran out of myself to spend. I knew it. I'd met it outside Sarai's tent, in the hand of the broad ones Siriel had sent to do the work the others couldn't. The shaped absence that doesn't cut so much as unmake, that had taken my blade inch by inch and left it shorter than it was forged. I'd survived that night by closing distance, by denial, by not giving the edge anything to find. I knew that answer, but the pressure was still there and I was losing the ground. And I had a weapon that took whatever I gave it on one side and an old weight pressing from the other, and 3 days of fighting behind me, and Sarai on the other side of the wall. I stopped. Not the blade work. My hands kept moving, kept working around the unmaking edge the way I'd learned, keeping the distance, denying it contact. But the other fight, the contest of authority, the weight I'd been pressing against since it arrived, I stopped not because I chose to, but because I had nothing left to press with. I just stood in it. Whatever was left of me after 3 days, just standing. And in the gap where my claim had been, the thread came up. Not as a thought. I didn't reason my way to it. It came the way a current comes when you stop fighting the water, something that had been there the whole time underneath the noise of the struggle. Seth, Noah, Shem, all the names between. The long line I'd been following before this palace was a foundation in the sand. Teru walking out of Ur with a direction he didn't fully understand. Abram at his altar with his hands open. Sarai at her stone, wearing it smooth with asking. The child she hadn't born yet, the nation, the blessing for all the families of the earth. I hadn't made any of that, nor had I brought it here. The thread I carried had been in this ground before either of us arrived, before Egypt was a name, before the fallen pressing this wall had found its first foothold in the dark above the river. The pressure bore down looking for my claim to answer and found I wasn't making one. It pressed at my authority and found I'd let it go. What was holding the eastern wall wasn't me at all. And there is nothing to take from one who has stopped holding. The unmaking weapon committed to a strike and found nothing. One breath, and I took the weapon bearer. The old one withdrew from the wall. Not broken, not driven back. Withdrawing the way Siriel always withdrew, patience rather than retreat, a longer game still running. But it left the ground. I stood in the quiet afterward and didn't understand what it held. Only that the wall was still mine, and Sarai was on the other side of it, and the thread was intact. And whatever I'd stood in for those few seconds, it hadn't been my own strength. Later, when Michael came along the perimeter to check the line, he stopped beside me. He looked at the wall, then he looked at me. The same cold expression he'd carried since we arrived, but a different look underneath. Something I didn't have a name for. He didn't say anything. He moved on. I didn't know what he'd seen, and I didn't ask. I held both positions through the rest of that day. Not by being stronger, but by carrying something older than me. Serial came on the second night. He appeared across the perimeter from me, close enough to speak, far enough that I'd have to leave my post to reach him. He knew I wouldn't, and he was counting on it. Day 2, Serial said. She's still in there, Kemuel. Every hour she stays, the thread frays. Pharaoh thinks he's taking a wife. He has no idea what he's actually reaching for. She's protected, I said. For how long? He moved a little along the line, unhurried, moving like a creature that wanted you to feel how much time he had. Your line is thin. Terrell is down and you're covering 2 posts at once. How many more hours can you hold? As many as it takes, I said. He tilted his head. Here's what I find interesting. Not that Abram lied, but that they all lie. That you're the one paying for it. You and your detail, wearing yourselves down to nothing to guard a promise the chosen one himself was willing to trade for cattle. I didn't answer. My blade was ready, but my words were empty. Because he wasn't wrong about the facts, only about what they meant. This is what the love of your God comes to in the end, Serial said. The faithful pay for the failures of the faithless. The warriors carry the cost so the cowards can profit. And he watches it from his throne and calls it good. He let that sit. Is that who you serve? The one who lets this happen? The one who's going to stop it, I said. When? Serial asked. Before Pharaoh claims her, or after? He drew back into his formations before I could answer, patient, watching, waiting for the thread to snap. The 3rd day. My arms were heavy, and the rest of me was heavier still. The eastern wall had held, but I could see the cost in the wounds I carried. In Terrell's thinned light somewhere behind the line. In the worn-down quiet of every angel on that perimeter. 3 days of fighting a force fresh enough to rotate while we stood fixed. Then I felt it. God, coming down over the palace. Not the awareness that comes with prayer. This came direct, the whole weight of his attention settling on Pharaoh's household until every angel on the line straightened and every fallen pulled back. The affliction started that evening. I don't know exactly what he did. Later men would call it disease, and that's true, and it isn't enough. What I felt was a pressure. His displeasure pressed down into the world itself, moving through the household like heat moving through metal. Servants fell ill. Advisors doubled over with pain they couldn't account for. The women of Pharaoh's court burned with fevers no physician could touch. It found them one by one, and it frightened me. The way his own hand always frightens me. Not because it's cruel, but because of how little of his strength it takes. He didn't send an army or throw down the walls or kill a single soul. He leaned his displeasure against the world, just leaned on it, and the whole house buckled. Pharaoh's advisors hunted for causes, and his physicians offered cures that failed. His priests asked their gods, and their gods had nothing to say because they had never been there to say it. And somewhere in the confusion, someone noticed that all of it had begun the day the Hebrew woman arrived. Pharaoh sent for Abram. I positioned myself above the throne room. Below me Pharaoh sat in his chair of state, and his face was the face of a man who has run into a power that makes his own look like a child's. Anger and fear, and under them the dawning understanding that the Hebrew's God was real and was not pleased. Abram stood before him. And for the first time since we'd crossed the border, his face held something other than fear, shame, the settled. soul-deep kind that comes when a liar is caught by a man who had every right to the truth. "What have you done to me?" Pharaoh said. His voice filled the room with a king's authority and a humbled man's tremor both. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" "Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her for my own?" Abram didn't answer. There was no answer that would have been enough. "Here is your wife," Pharaoh said. "Take her and go." Sarai walked out of the palace. I saw her come through the doors into the courtyard, and the thread confirmed it, untouched, whole. The promise I'd guarded for 3 days unbroken. Whatever Pharaoh had intended, God had come before any of it could be done. She walked to Abram and he reached for her hand. She let him take it, but her face was turned away, and the set of her shoulders told me what the 3 days had cost her. Not the body. The other cost, the one that leaves no mark and carves itself instead into the space between two people who were supposed to trust each other. Pharaoh gave them an escort to the border, not to honor them. Armed men made certain the Hebrew and his God and his household left Egypt and didn't return. Abram walked out with everything he'd brought and everything Pharaoh had given him, the flocks, the servants, and the wealth that was the price of the lie. He kept all of it. I didn't understand that. God had rescued them in spite of Abram's failure, and Abram walked away richer than he'd come. The lie had cost Sarai 3 days of fear, had cost us 3 days of desperate fighting, and had cost Terrell a piece of himself that wasn't coming back. Yet, Abram profited. Michael fell in beside me as we escorted the household north. "You're judging him," he said. "He let them take her to save himself," I said, "and he kept the cattle." "He did," Michael said. "It isn't fair," I said. Michael watched the road a while. When he spoke, there was something close to amusement under it. "You keep waiting for it to be fair." I didn't have an answer. I told you at the border. Protection was never conditional on Abram getting it right. He kept walking. "What you're looking at now is what that costs. It costs this, a frightened man keeping his cattle and the promise alive anyway." "Then what's it resting on?" I asked. "If not him?" Michael didn't answer that one. He'd answered it once already, in his way. And he wasn't going to hand it to me a second time just because I'd asked again. We crossed back into Canaan, and the famine had eased. Not broken, but eased, with enough rain to green the hills and bring the springs back. Abram led the household toward Bethel, back to the ground between Bethel and Ai where he'd raised his first altar in this land. He built another one. Same ground, the same chosen stones, the same posture, kneeling with his hands open and his face turned up. He didn't explain Egypt. Didn't confess it or argue it or excuse it. He called on the name of the Lord. The smoke rose, and whatever passed between him and God in that hour stayed between them. Sarai stood beside him, not behind him, but beside him. Her hands at her sides, her face composed, watching her husband pray with the expression of a woman who has decided to stay. Staying isn't the same as forgiving. I knew that much, even without a human life to teach me. But it was a choice, and it was hers, and she made it on her own. The fallen had trailed us back. They kept their distance, watching from past the perimeter as they always did. Siriel wasn't among them. He'd made his point in Egypt and withdrawn, patient as ever, waiting for the next failure. There would be a next one. Not a guess, but a certainty I had no power to change. Abram had built altars in a land that wasn't his, and he had handed his wife to a king to save himself. And I had watched him do both. And I couldn't make the two men fit inside the one. He would fail again. He might fail in just this way again. I didn't have a name for what that made him, and I'd stopped reaching for one. And God would keep working through him. That was the thing I carried out of Egypt and couldn't set down. I had spent 3 days fighting for a promise the man himself had been willing to trade. And God had kept it anyway. And I couldn't tell you why. Not why he chose this man. Not why he let it cost what it cost. Not why the thread held through a lie when it could have broken clean and started again with someone braver. I believed he was right to do it. I believe it still. I just couldn't see how it was right. And he didn't show me. And I had long since stopped expecting him to. Terrell lived. His light came back slow, as the deep wounds do, and the part that thinned on that wall never fully came back. I sat with him once and felt it. Not a wound exactly, but an absence on one side of him, permanent now. A gap that wasn't going to close. He held the same as always, and it didn't seem to trouble him. I tried to thank him for the 2 words. He looked at me once. "You held," he said. That was all. Egypt taught me how to fight out of strength that wasn't mine. I didn't know yet how much I'd need to know the difference. I looked at Sarai, standing at the altar beside her husband. The woman who'd prayed for a child until she ran out of prayers. Who'd followed a voice she never heard to a land she'd never seen. Who'd been handed to a king by the man who was supposed to shield her, and walked out with her dignity whole because angels held the line.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.